This is Speaking of Justice. I'm Scott Drake, and you're watching the Legal Broadcast Network. In a report from the Maryland Commission on Capital Punishment, the people of the state and their elected representatives have all the evidence needed to abolish the death penalty. In the report, over the past 30 years, the death penalty in Maryland has been expensive and ineffective, riddled with error, and tainted with racial and geographic disparities beyond reform, concluding that it should be abolished. My guest is Professor Bryan Stevenson from NYU. He is an expert in the death penalty and has defended death row inmates all over the South. Bryan, welcome.
Thank you.
Talk about this report and how it arrived at these conclusions.
Yeah, it's a really interesting process. The state of Maryland has been rethinking the death penalty for several years. The state legislature has come very close to passing legislation that would either eliminate the death penalty or would, seriously suspend it. There have been moratoria in the state of Maryland because of concerns about the fairness of the death penalty there, and specifically concerns about racial bias, wrongful convictions. One of the earliest exonerations of innocent people on death row was in the state of Maryland. Kirk Bloodsworth was exonerated based on DNA testing in the early 90s, and I think it shook the confidence of a lot of people who had been strong advocates for the death penalty in the state of Maryland. So this commission was set up. It had 22, 23 members, prosecutors, law enforcement officials, attorneys, judges, citizens, and after several hearings and listening to dozens of people testify, they issued a report that recommended that the death penalty be abolished, and that was based on careful consideration of a lot of areas relating to the fairness of the death penalty, the reliability of the death penalty, and very interesting, the cost of the death penalty.
Talk about the racial and geographic data in this report, and maybe speak a little bit about your experience defending death row inmates. Does what you see coincide with this report?
Yes. I mean, the race has been a huge problem in the administration of the death penalty nationwide for many years. I mean, it's worth, I think, mentioning that in 1972, when the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the death penalty, they did it in part because the death penalty was being applied in such a racially biased manner. When the court in Furman versus Georgia said the death penalty is arbitrary, it's like being struck by lightning and therefore unconstitutional, they were really relying on evidence that showed, huge disparities, gross disparities in the death penalty based on race. About at that time, 88%, 89% of the people who had been executed for the crime of rape in the U.S. between 1930 and 1972 were black men convicted of raping white women. There were other disparities for homicides, and that really kind of led to the initial ban on capital punishment in 1972. Of course, the court reinstated the death penalty in 1976 with the modern era, but in the 1980s also revisited the question of the death penalty and race, and once again, in a very close decision, found substantial evidence of racial bias. That McCleskey case, which is quite notorious in civil rights circles, was decided by the court in 1987, and there the court had been presented with evidence that in the state of Georgia, you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black, 22 times more likely to get the death penalty if the defendant is black and the victim is white. And that is consistent with what I've seen. I practice a lot across the Deep South. There are these gigantic disparities in the state of Alabama where I spend a lot of time. About 80% of the people on death row are there for crimes involving victims who are white, even though 66% of all murder victims in the state of Alabama are black. And these disparities have been combined with other kind of evidence, case evidence of racial bias. We've got a huge number of cases where prosecutors exclude all African Americans from jury service. I actually just argued a case at the 11th Circuit a couple months ago where the prosecutor used peremptory strikes to exclude all 16 African Americans qualified for jury service in a majority black county, and an African American defendant was actually tried by an all-white jury. The prosecutor defended the first 6 strikes he made of African Americans by saying that these black people, quote, looked like people of low intelligence with no record evidence to support that. And the courts have upheld that, and it's, I think, one of the many reasons why people looking at the death penalty have always been troubled by those kinds of incidents, those kinds of anecdotes, but also this overall statistical picture. And that's certainly what the Maryland Commission found when it looked at what's going on in Maryland. Over this 30-year time period, the evidence around racial bias was perhaps the most compelling evidence that the Commission faced. The final vote on abolishing the death penalty was 13-9 by Commission members. The vote on whether there is evidence of racial bias, serious racial bias, was 20-1. I think even supporters of the death penalty were troubled by this evidence of racial bias. At Maryland's death row is almost all black. Almost all of the people on death row have been sentenced to death for crimes involving victims who are white. And there's a huge disparity between the percentage of cases that get prosecuted capitally that involve white victims and black victims. And that's pretty consistent across the country, and I think Maryland is not exceptional in that regard.
How do supporters of the death penalty there react to the data? As the death penalty is used as a deterrent in some northeastern states, it's not even a possibility. But the murder rate in states where the death penalty is active is far higher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the really, kind of compelling lessons that has come out of this kind of 30-year history. I think the death penalty was sold in a lot of jurisdictions as a way to combat crime, to limit crime. It really hasn't had that effect. The murder rate in states has not been influenced in any meaningful way by the incidence of execution or death sentence. If anything, we've found that those states have done not as well as states without the death penalty in seeing declines in homicide and murder. So I think that the deterrence component of death penalty support has really faded. There was an effort a few years ago to try to revive that argument, but I don't think any serious policy advocate who works on this issue sees much support for the death penalty if the goal is deterrence. And I think that's made the cost-benefit analysis a lot more compelling for people who really want something for the millions of dollars that we spend to have death penalties in many of these states.
Do you think with the economic downturn in so many states and financial trouble that might be impetus enough for other states to begin looking at this in a similar way to Maryland?
I think it will. I don't think there's any question that the cost of the death penalty has, in many jurisdictions, really bankrupt the ability to enforce other areas of criminal justice. The state of Maryland spent, under one estimate, $186 million between 1978 and 1999 to administer capital punishment. What they got for that expenditure was less than 5 executions. To keep people on death row is twice as much. They're spending about $68,000 a year to keep folks under sentence of death. These are enormous costs, and I think as the economic challenges have become clearer and more demanding, there are going to have to be adjustments. And so, yeah, I think that is going to be an issue. Every state that studied the cost of the death penalty has concluded that it costs a lot more to have a death penalty than to have, sentences of life imprisonment without parole for some of these really serious offenses. And, a lot of people will, I think, legitimately ask, is it reasonable to spend $186 million, $200 million over a 20-year time period just to accomplish 3 or 4 executions?
My guest is NYU law professor Bryan Stevenson. He is an expert on the death penalty and has defended many death row inmates throughout the South. Professor Stevenson, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
You're watching the Legal Broadcast Network. I'm Scott Drake, speaking of justice.